The skyline of Chicago didn't look like a city tonight. It looked like a jagged blade pressed against the throat of the sky. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, the neon lights of the Loop bled into the rain-slicked streets, painting the pavement in shades of bruised purple and electric blue. I stood there, a glass of neat bourbon in my hand, watching the world I was born to rule and destined to bleed for. My name is Dante Moretti. In this city, that name is a prayer to some and a death warrant to others. I am the underboss of the Moretti Syndicate, the man who bridges the gap between the legitimate boardrooms and the blood-stained backrooms. My life is governed by three things: omerta, loyalty to the Don, who happens to be my father, and the cold, hard reality that in our world, love is a liability that gets people buried in the foundations of skyscrapers. I checked my watch. Midnight was approaching. The city felt restless, humming with the kind of tension that usually preceded a war. My father, Lorenzo, had been pushing for an expansion into the north side, territories held by the Romanovs for decades. It was a move that invited chaos, but in our business, stagnation is just a slow way to die. I took a sip of the bourbon, the burn grounding me. My life was a series of calculated moves, a chess game played with lives instead of pieces. But lately, the board had changed. The pieces were moving on their own, and for the first time in 32 years, I felt like I was losing my grip on the silver spoon I'd been forced to sharpen into a shiv. The interior of the velvet cage was a sensory assault of expensive perfume, Cuban cigar smoke, and the low, thrumming bass of a jazz band that knew when to keep their patterns predictable. It was a neutral ground, or as neutral as any place could be when the air was thick with the scent of unpunished sins. I sat in a secluded booth in the back, shadowed by a velvet curtain that muffled the clinking of glasses. My cousin Luca stood by the entrance, his hand hovering near the lapel of his tailored Armani suit, a silent sentinel. I wasn't here for a deal. I was here because of a ghost. 3 nights ago, a name had surfaced in the wiretaps. Elena Ricci, the daughter of a man my father had retired 15 years ago. She was supposed to be in Florence, living a life funded by the guilt money my father sent her mother. Instead, she was here, in the heart of the beast, working as a high-stakes dealer for the underground games. I saw her then, weaving through the tables. She moved with a grace that didn't belong in a room full of vultures. Her hair was the color of midnight, tied back in a way that exposed the elegant line of her throat. When her eyes met mine across the smoky room, the world slowed down. There was no fear in her gaze, only a sharp, piercing intelligence that saw right through the expensive suit and the reputation. She knew exactly who I was. I was the son of the man who broke her world, and I was the man who currently held the keys to it. I motioned for her to come over. It was a command disguised as an invitation. Elena didn't hesitate. She walked with a deliberate pace, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a ticking clock. As she reached the booth, the tension between us was a physical thing, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice a low, melodic friction that stirred something I had long ago buried under layers of iron and ice. "I didn't think this was your scene. Too many witnesses, not enough shadows." I slid a glass toward her. "The shadows follow me, Elena. I don't need to go looking for them. Why are you in Chicago? This city isn't safe for a Ricci." She sat down, her movements fluid, and ignored the drink. "Safety is an illusion, Dante. I learned that when I was 12 years age. I'm here because I have something your father wants and something you need." Her boldness was intoxicating. Most people stuttered in my presence, their eyes darting toward the exits. She leaned in, the scent of jasmine and something darker, perhaps gunpowder, clinging to her. The Romanovs are planning a sit-down with the Irish. They want to cut the Mortys out of the waterfront entirely. And they're using my father's old contacts to do it. It was a betrayal of her own legacy, or perhaps a play for a new one. I watched her closely, looking for the lie. In our world, a woman with a secret is more dangerous than a man with a gun. Why tell me? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You owe my family nothing but a shallow grave. Elena leaned back, a small, bitter smile playing on her lips. I don't do this for your family. I do this for myself. The Romanovs killed what was left of my mother's spirit. If I'm going to live in a world of monsters, I'd rather be on the side of the one I know. I reached out, my fingers grazing the pulse point on her wrist. Her heart was racing, but her hand was steady. You're playing a dangerous game, Elena. If my father finds out you're back, he won't see an informant. He'll see a loose end. Her eyes darkened, a flash of defiance sparking in the green depths. Then don't let him find out. You're the underboss. You handle the loose ends, don't you? The subtext was a blade between us. I was supposed to report her. I was supposed to eliminate any threat to the Morty name. Instead, I found myself captivated by the fire in her eyes. Come with me, I said, the words out of my mouth before my brain could veto them. Somewhere we can talk without the Romanov spies listening to every breath. As we stood to leave, the air in the club felt thinner. I was breaking a dozen rules of the Omertad just by standing next to her. But as I led her through the back exit into the cold Chicago rain, I knew I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. We ended up at an old, disused social club in Little Italy, a place that smelled of stale espresso and old secrets. I turned on a single dim light over a scarred poker table. The rain hammered against the boarded-up windows, creating a sanctuary of sorts. You mentioned my father's contacts, I began, pacing the small room like a caged animal. If the Romanovs have the docks, we lose the shipments from Sicily. That's the lifeblood of our operation. Elena leaned against the table, the light casting long, dramatic shadows across her face. They have more than the docks, Dante. They have a mole inside your inner circle, someone who's been feeding them the manifests for months. My blood went cold. A mole meant a traitor, and a traitor meant a bloodbath. Who? She shook her head. I don't have a name yet, only a lead. But it costs. Information is the only currency I value. I stepped closer, closing the distance until I could feel the heat radiating off her. And what is it you want, Elena? Money? Protection? A way out, she looked up at me, and for a second, the mask of the hardened gambler slipped, revealing a girl who had lost everything. I want to feel like I'm not a ghost in my own life. I want the Romanovs to burn for what they did, and I want you to remember that not everyone who fights you is an enemy. I reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. My touch was a transgression, a violation of the code that kept us apart. In this city, the only difference between an enemy and a friend is how long it takes for them to put a bullet in your back. The memory hit me then, unbidden and brutal. I was 22, standing in a warehouse much like this one, watching my father execute a man who had been like an uncle to me. Uncle Silvio had been caught skimming off the top. I remembered the way the light had caught the barrel of my father's chrome .45. I remembered the silence that followed the shot, a silence so loud it felt like it would never end. Loyalty is the only thing that keeps us alive, my father had said, stepping over the body without a second glance. Never let your heart make a decision your head has to pay for, Dante. I looked at Elena now, the daughter of a man my father had destroyed, and I felt the weight of that memory like a physical burden. I was the heir to a throne built on the bones of people like her family. You shouldn't be here, I whispered, my hand lingering on her jaw. You should have stayed in Italy. You should have stayed a ghost." Elena didn't flinch. She leaned into my touch, a move that was both a surrender and a provocation. "The ghosts are the only ones who know the truth, Dante. Your father thinks he buried the past. But the past has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. The chemistry between us was a volatile mix of hatred, lust, and a shared understanding of the darkness. I wanted to push her away, to protect the organization, to protect myself. But as her lips parted slightly, all I could think about was how much I wanted to tear down the world just to keep her in it. The next few days were a blur of clandestine meetings and mounting paranoia. I began auditing the manifests, looking for the discrepancies Elena had mentioned. Every time I sat across from my capos, I wondered which one was the serpent in the garden. Each smile felt like a grimace. Each "yes, boss" sounded like a lie. I met Elena every night at midnight, sometimes in a car parked by the darkened piers, sometimes in the back of a 24-hour diner, where the waitress was too tired to care about the two people whispering in the corner booth. We spoke in riddles, our dialogues charged with a subtext that neither of us dared to name. "You're looking for a shadow," she told me one night as we watched the fog roll off Lake Michigan. "But shadows don't leave fingerprints. Look for the man who suddenly has nothing to lose." I looked at her, the moonlight silvering her skin. "And what about you, Elena? What do you have to lose?" She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "I lost everything a long time ago. Now I'm just playing with the house's money." I reached for her hand, my fingers interlacing with hers. It was a small gesture, but in our world it was an act of war. "If they find out about us, there won't be a sit-down. There won't be a trial. My father will simply erase you, and he might erase me too." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then let's make sure they don't find out." The pressure from my father was intensifying. "The Romanovs are getting bold, Dante," he growled during our Sunday dinner, a tradition that felt more like an interrogation. "They hijacked a truck in Cicero, my trucks, on my streets." He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, making the wine glasses rattle. "I want a message sent. I want their youngest Victor to understand that the North Side isn't a playground." Handle it was the Morty euphemism for a hit. Victor Romanov was a hothead, but he was also the apple of his father's eye. Killing him would trigger a full-scale war. I nodded, the mask of the dutiful son firmly in place. "Consider it done, Papa." But as I left the mansion, my mind was racing. If I killed Victor, the city would burn, and in the fire, Elena would be the first to go. I needed a different way. I needed to find the mole and use them as a bargaining chip. I drove straight to the safe house where I'd been keeping the files Elena gave me. The deeper I dug, the more the trail led to Luca, my cousin, my shadow, my closest friend. The realization was a cold blade to the ribs. If Luca was the mole, then the Romanovs knew everything. They knew about my meetings with Elena. They were just waiting for the right moment to spring the trap. I caught up with Luca at a social club in the Heights. He was playing cards, a confident smirk on his face. I beckoned him to the back room, the one with the soundproofed walls and the drain in the center of the floor. "Dante, what's up? You look like you've seen a ghost," Luca joked, cracking a beer. I didn't smile. I locked the door behind us. "I found the leak, Luca, the manifests from the Cicero shipments. You were the only one with the keys to the encryption." Luca's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold, the eyes of a predator. "Dante, we're family. You really think I didn't let him finish. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "Don't use that word, not to me. The Romanovs promised you what? A seat at the table." "My seat," Luca laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Your father is a relic, Dante. He's obsessed with the old ways, the Romanovs. They understand the future. Global, digital, no more blood in the streets unless it's necessary. I pulled my piece, the weight of the Beretta familiar and heavy. And Elena, was she part of the plan? Were you using her to get to me? Luca's expression shifted to something like pity. Elena Ricci, she's a wild card. We didn't send her, but we knew she'd find you. You always did have a soft spot for tragic cases. It's your biggest flaw, cousin. I felt a surge of rage, but I held it back. Where is she, Luca? If you touched her, Luca chuckled. I didn't have to. Victor already has her. He figured out she was playing both sides. You want her back. You bring the encryption codes for the Sicilian bank accounts to the pier at midnight. Or she dies, and the Moretti name dies with her. I left Luca tied and gagged in that back room, my mind a storm of conflicting loyalties. I had the codes. I also had the duty to tell my father. If I told him, he'd send a hit squad to the pier. Elena would be collateral damage, but the Romanovs would be decimated. If I went alone, I was a traitor. I was choosing a girl over the family. I was breaking the omerta. I sat in my car, the engine idling, the rain turning into a torrential downpour. I thought about the first time I saw Elena, the way she looked at me like I was something more than a monster. I thought about my father's face as he killed Silvio. My life had been a series of walls built to keep the world out, but Elena had walked through them like they were made of mist. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a single dark emerald. It was an heirloom, something that had been in my family for generations. I had intended to give it to her tonight, a symbol of a promise I wasn't even sure I could keep. Now it felt like a weight in my pocket. I checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. The pier was 10 minutes away. I put the car in gear and drove, the city blurring into a streak of gray and neon. The waterfront was a wasteland of rusted shipping containers and skeletal cranes. The wind howled through the gaps, sounding like the screams of the damned. I parked my car a block away and approached on foot, my hand gripped tight on my weapon. I could see the silhouette of a black SUV idling at the end of Pier 42. Two men stood outside, their cigarettes glowing like demonic eyes in the dark. As I got closer, I saw a figure huddled in the back seat. Elena. Her face was pale against the glass, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something I couldn't identify. Resignation. Victor Romanov stepped out of the shadows, a smug grin on his face. He was younger than me, dressed in a flashy leather jacket that screamed new money. Dante Moretti. I didn't think you'd actually show. Giving up the family jewels for a girl. Your father must be spinning in his grave, and he's not even dead yet. I stopped 10 feet away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Let her go, Victor. I have what you want. The codes are on a thumb drive in my pocket. You get them when she's safe on that sidewalk. Victor chuckled, signaling his men. They pulled Elena out of the car. She was shivering, her dress torn at the shoulder, but she held her head high. Dante, don't, she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. It's a trap. Shut up, Victor snapped, shoving her forward. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. The codes first, Dante, that's the deal. Or maybe I just kill both of you and take them off your corpses. My father would appreciate the efficiency. I felt the cold realization that I wasn't getting out of here without a fight, but I had to get her clear. Fine, I said, reaching into my pocket. My fingers brushed the velvet box, then the thumb drive. I tossed the drive into the air between us. As Victor's eyes followed the small piece of plastic, I lunged. I grabbed Elena, spinning her behind a stack of crates just as the first shots rang out. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of ozone and lead. I returned fire. the recoil of the Beretta vibrating up my arm. "Stay down!" I shouted over the din. I managed to clip one of the guards, sending him spiraling into the oily water of the harbor. Victor was screaming orders, diving behind the SUV. It was a stalemate, but time was running out. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the wail of sirens. My father's men, the police. It didn't matter. Either way, we were cornered. In the brief, ringing silence between volleys, I looked at Elena. She was staring at me, her eyes searching mine. I realized then that I didn't care about the Mortys. I didn't care about the Romanovs. I only cared about the woman breathing heavily beside me in the dark. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the velvet box. My hands were steady now, the adrenaline of the fight replaced by a strange, calm clarity. "Elena," I said, the name of vow. She looked at the box, then at the gun in my other hand. "Dante, what are you doing?" "We're going to die." I shook my head, popping the lid. The emerald caught the faint light of a street lamp, glowing with a deep, haunting green. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I brushed her collarbone. "Midnight," I whispered, glancing at the clock on my phone. 12 o'clock. The world was ending, and yet it was just beginning. I leaned in, the necklace dangling from my fingers, the gold cool against her skin. "I wanted to give this to you under different circumstances," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. As I fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, her skin felt like silk against my rough palms. She looked down at the emerald, her hand rising to touch it. "It's beautiful," she breathed, a single tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. I looked at her, my heart heavy with a truth I had only just realized. I leaned closer, my lips inches from hers, the heat of our breath mingling in the frozen air. "It belonged to my last lover," I said, the words tasting like ash, "before she died." Elena froze, her eyes searching mine for the lie, the warning, the tragedy that was about to unfold. The sirens were louder now, the headlights of the approaching cars cutting through the fog like the eyes of a hungry beast. The war had arrived, and we were standing at the center of the storm. The sirens were a dissonant choir, shrieking through the fog as the blue and red lights began to dance across the rusted steel of the pier. Elena's hand remained frozen over the emerald, her skin pale, her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying clarity. The air between us was heavy with the words I had just uttered, a confession that sounded like a curse. "It belonged to my last lover before she died." I saw the question in her eyes, the flicker of a woman wondering if she was looking at her savior or her executioner. I didn't have time to explain that my past was a graveyard I visited only in my nightmares. I didn't have time to tell her that the woman who wore that stone before her hadn't been killed by my hand, but by my life. I grabbed her arm, my grip firm but not bruising. "We have to move. Now." Victor was screaming from behind the SUV, his voice cracking with desperation as he realized his leverage was gone and the law was closing in. "Morty, you think this emerald buys her life? You're both dead men walking." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a glance. I pulled Elena toward the shadows of a stack of containers, the cold rain slicking the ground beneath us. Every step felt like a gamble with gravity. Behind us, the heavy thud of car doors slamming and the bark of orders told me the police had arrived. But in Chicago, a police raid at midnight usually meant someone had been paid to look the other way while a specific target was cleared out. The question was, who paid them and who was the target? We navigated the labyrinth of the shipping district, the scent of brine and diesel stinging my nostrils. Elena followed my lead, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, but she didn't stumble. There was a resilience in her that I hadn't expected, a steel spine forged in the same fires that had once tried to consume her family. We reached a secondary perimeter where I'd stashed a nondescript black sedan earlier that evening. a contingency for a night I had hoped would go differently. I shoved her into the passenger seat and vaulted over the hood, the engine roaring to life with a predatory purr. As I peeled away, the tires screaming against the asphalt, I risked a glance at her. She was staring straight ahead, her hands still clutched around the emerald necklace as if it were an anchor keeping her from drifting into the abyss. "Who was she?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos we had just fled. I didn't need her to clarify. Her name was Isabella, I said, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. A lifetime ago, before I was the underboss, before I fully understood that every gift from a Morty comes with a death certificate. I saw Elena swallow hard, the emerald glinting in the dash light. "And you gave this to me anyway." I turned a sharp corner, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of warning. "In my world, Elena, we don't buy flowers, we buy armor, or we buy time. I'm trying to buy you both." I drove us to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript brownstone that looked like any other decaying remnant of the industrial era. Inside, the air was stale, but the locks were reinforced and the windows were bulletproof. I didn't turn on the overhead lights, opting for a single lamp in the corner that bathed the room in a low, amber glow. Elena stood by the fireplace, her shoulders hunched, the weight of the night finally beginning to crush her. I poured 2 stiff glasses of bourbon, my hands finally betraying the adrenaline that was beginning to ebb. I walked over and handed her a glass. She took it, her fingers brushing mine, and for a second the world outside, the Romanovs, the Mortys, the blood in the harbor, didn't exist. There was only the heat of her skin and the dark, desperate pull of a romance that was born under a falling guillotine. "You said she died because of your life," Elena whispered, looking up at me. "Is that what's happening here? Am I just the next ghost in your collection?" I stepped closer, the space between us charged with a tension that was more dangerous than any bullet. "I spent 10 years trying to convince myself I didn't have a heart so that I wouldn't have to watch it break again. Then you walked into the velvet cage, and I realized I'd just been holding my breath for a decade." She set the glass down and reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the lapel of my coat. "My father was a Ricci. I grew up knowing that every I love you could be a goodbye, but I never thought I'd be standing here, wearing a dead woman's jewelry, protected by the man who should be my natural enemy." I leaned down, my forehead resting against hers. "There are no natural enemies in this city, Elena, only rivals and victims. I'm trying to make sure you're neither." The subtext of our proximity was a silent scream. I wanted to kiss her with the desperation of a man who knew he might not see the sunrise. I wanted to tell her that I would burn the Morty Empire to the ground to keep her safe. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because the betrayal I'd uncovered with Luca was only the tip of the iceberg. Looking at the emerald around her neck, I remembered the way Isabella had smiled before the car bomb turned her into a memory. I wouldn't let history repeat itself. I reached around her, my fingers working the clasp of her dress just enough to see the pale curve of her shoulder. "You're cold," I murmured, a poor excuse for the intimacy I was craving. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into me, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "I've been cold for 15 years, Dante. Tonight is the first time I've felt the heat." But the heat was a house on fire. The following morning, the sun didn't bring clarity, it brought a message. I found it pinned to the door of the safe house when I stepped out to survey the perimeter. A single black dove, its neck snapped, a Romanov calling card. They knew where we were. The safe house was no longer safe. I hurried back inside, finding Elena by the window, watching the street with a hawk-like intensity. "They found us," I said, my voice low and urgent. She didn't look surprised. "Luca told them, didn't he?" I nodded. Even tied and gagged, a man like Luca has ways of making noise. He's been a Romanov asset for longer than I realized. It wasn't just shipping manifests, Elena. He was selling them the keys to our kingdom, including our locations. I grabbed my bag and checked the chamber of my handgun. We have to go to the only place they won't expect us, the heart of Moretti territory. My father's estate in Lake Forest. Elena's eyes widened. That's suicide. Your father will see me and he'll finish what he started 15 years ago. I stepped toward her, grabbing her by the waist and pulling her flush against me. He won't touch you because he needs me more than he hates your name, and because if he tries, he'll have to go through me first. The drive to Lake Forest was a silent prayer. The Moretti estate was a fortress, high stone walls topped with wrought iron spikes, guarded by men whose only loyalty was to the paycheck and the fear my father instilled in them. As we pulled through the gates, the guards recognized my car and waved us through, but their eyes lingered on the woman in the passenger seat. They knew a Ricci when they saw one. The family resemblance was a mark of Cain in our circle. We pulled up to the main house, a sprawling Gothic mansion that seemed to absorb the light. My father, Lorenzo Moretti, was waiting in the study. He sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of oak, a man who looked like he had been chiseled from the same stone as the house. He didn't rise when we entered. He just stared at the emerald around Elena's neck. "You gave her Isabella's stone," he said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves. "A bold move, Dante, or a very stupid one?" Elena didn't flinch. She stood beside me, her chin tilted up, a queen in exile. "It wasn't a move, Don Lorenzo," she said. "It was a warning." My father chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "A Ricci with a spine. Your father would be proud right before I put the bullet in him. Dante, explain why this girl is in my house instead of at the bottom of the lake." I stepped forward, putting myself between my father and Elena. "Because Luca is a traitor, Papa. He sold the Cicero roots to the Romanovs. He's the reason the docks are a graveyard, and Elena is the only reason I found out before they took the whole waterfront." I saw my father's eyes narrow. The mention of Luca hit home. Luca was his sister's son, blood of our blood. Betrayal within the family was a wound that never truly healed. "Luca," he whispered, the name a curse. I nodded. "I have the logs. I have the encryption keys he used. He's been working with Viktor Romanov for 18 months. My father leaned back, his gaze shifting to Elena. "And what does she want in exchange for this loyalty? Moretti protection." "A seat at the table." I looked at Elena, and for a second I saw the vulnerability behind the mask. "She wants what we all want, Papa, survival, and I've promised her that." My father stood up then, his presence filling the room with an ancient, suffocating power. He walked around the desk until he was inches from Elena. He looked at the necklace again. "That stone has carried a lot of grief, girl. It has a habit of outlasting the women who wear it. Dante thinks he's saving you. But in this family, we don't save people. We use them until they're broken, then we discard them. Is that the life you want?" Elena met his gaze with a coldness that rivaled his own. "I've been broken since I was 12, Don Lorenzo. You already did your worst. Now I'm just deciding who gets to watch the pieces fall." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that felt like it would crack the walls. My father stared at her for a long minute, then turned back to me. "The Romanovs have called a sit-down for tonight. Neutral ground. St. Jude's Cathedral. They want to discuss restitutions for the pier incident. They think they have the upper hand because they have Luca. They don't know we know." He looked at his watch. "You will go, Dante. You will bring the girl. We will show them that a Ricci and a Moretti standing together is more dangerous than any traitor. But if this is a trap, If she's playing you, I didn't let him finish. She's not. I'd stake my life on it. My father's smile was a thin, cruel line. You already have, son. You already have. As we left the study, the air in the hallway felt like a reprieve. But I knew the real test was coming. The cathedral wasn't just neutral ground. It was a sanctuary of secrets, and tonight it would either be our salvation or our tomb. We had 4 hours before the sit-down. I took Elena to my old rooms in the East Wing, rooms I hadn't slept in for years. They were filled with the ghosts of a boy who had once thought he could be something other than an executioner. I locked the door and turned to her. She looked exhausted, her composure finally fraying at the edges. He's going to kill me, isn't he? If the sit-down goes wrong, your father will use me as a bargaining chip. I grabbed her hands, bringing them to my lips. I won't let that happen. Elena, look at me. She met my eyes, her own brimming with an unspoken fear. I've spent my whole life following the codes, silence, loyalty, blood, but none of it matters if you aren't there when the smoke clears. I'm not my father, and I'm not the boy who let Isabella die. I have a plan. She leaned into me, her head resting on my chest. Dante, the Romanovs, they don't just want the docks. Victor told me something at the pier. He said the serpent is already in the nest. He wasn't talking about Luca. He was talking about someone else, someone higher up. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hallways. Higher than Luca. That left only a handful of people. My father's consigliere, Silvio's son, or I didn't want to think about the other possibilities. In the quiet of the room, the romance we had been fighting against finally broke through the barriers. I kissed her then, not a gentle kiss, but a desperate, bruising collision of mouths that tasted of bourbon and salt. It was an admission of everything we couldn't say. I pulled her toward the bed, our movements frantic as we stripped away the layers of pretense and protection. In the dark, the emerald necklace was a cold spark against her warm skin. As I traced the line of her throat, I felt the pulse of her life, vibrant, terrified, and incredibly precious. I love you, I whispered, the words sounding foreign and dangerous in my own ears. She didn't say it back. She didn't have to. The way she clung to me, her nails digging into my back, told me everything I needed to know. We were two broken people trying to fuse our jagged edges together before the world shattered us completely. Don't let me go, she breathed into my ear. Even if the roof falls in, Dante. Don't let me go. I tightened my hold on her, praying to a God I'd long ago abandoned that I would have the strength to keep that promise. We stayed like that for an hour, a brief island of peace in a sea of encroaching violence, knowing that every tick of the clock was bringing us closer to the confrontation at the cathedral. The bells of St. Jude's were tolling 10 when we arrived. The cathedral was a massive, dark silhouette against the gray sky, its stained glass windows glowing like the eyes of ancient gods. Black SUVs lined the curb, Moretti vehicles on one side, Romanov vehicles on the other. It was a funeral for peace. I stepped out of the car, adjusting my tie, the weight of the holster beneath my arm a reassuring presence. Elena stepped out beside me, wearing a black dress that looked like mourning. The emerald shimmered against the fabric, a beacon in the gloom. My father was already at the entrance, flanked by his personal guard. He gave me a sharp nod. "Inside," he commanded. "The Romanovs are waiting in the sacristy." As we walked up the stone steps, I felt the eyes of a dozen gunmen on us. This wasn't a sit-down. It was a standoff. The interior of the cathedral was vast and chillingly silent. Our footsteps echoed off the vaulted ceiling as we made our way toward the back. The scent of incense and old wood hung heavy in the air. We entered the sacristy, a small wood-paneled room where the Romanov patriarch Mikhail sat waiting. Beside him was Victor, looking bruised but defiant, and to my horror, Luca. Luca looked at me, a sneer on his face. He wasn't tied up now. He was sitting at the table, a made man among our enemies. "Lorenzo," Mikkel said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded the room. "You brought the girl. I'm impressed. Usually you're more careful with your liabilities." My father sat down across from him, his expression impassive. "She's not a liability, Mikkel. She's a witness to the fact that your son is a common thief who uses traitors to do his dirty work." Mikkel chuckled, glancing at Luca. "Luca isn't a traitor, Lorenzo. He's a businessman who realized the Mortys are a sinking ship. He brought us the manifests. He brought us the bank codes. And tonight, he's going to help us finalize the transfer of the North Side." I stepped forward, my hand resting on the back of Elena's chair. "That's not going to happen. The codes you have are useless. I changed the encryptions the moment I realized Luca was skimming." The room went dead silent. Victor stood up, his hand hovering over his waistband. "You're lying, Morty." "We verified those accounts." I pulled a small tablet from my pocket and slid it across the table. "Check them again. They're empty. The money has been moved to a blind trust in Switzerland. And the only people who can access it are sitting on this side of the table." Luca's face went pale. He lunged for the tablet, but my father's guard moved faster, blocking his path. Mikkel looked at the tablet, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can rob me, Lorenzo, in a house of God?" My father leaned in, his voice a deadly whisper. "I'm not robbing you, Mikkel. I'm reclaiming what you stole. And for the trouble, I want the waterfront cleared. No Romanov ships, no Romanov crews by dawn." Victor let out a bark of laughter. "Or what? You're outnumbered 5-1 in this building. My men are in the rafters, Dante. One word from my father, and you and your Rixai whore are painted on the floor." I looked up, catching the glint of a rifle barrel in the choir loft. He wasn't lying. We were in a kill box, but I had one card left to play. "Victor, you should check your phone," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I sent you a video 10 minutes ago, something I think your father should see." Victor frowned, reaching into his pocket. He watched the screen for a few seconds, his face draining of color. He handed the phone to Mikkel. The video was a live feed of the Romanovs' main distribution warehouse, the one where they kept their entire supply of heroin before it hit the streets. In the video, a man stood with a flare gun. "That's my man, Mikhail," I said. "If I don't check in every 15 minutes, he pulls the trigger. Your entire year's profit goes up in smoke." The standoff was absolute. For 10 minutes, no one spoke. The tension was a living thing, stretching between us until it felt like it would snap and take the whole building with it. Then the doors of the sacristy burst open. It wasn't gunmen. It was my father's consigliere, his face streaked with sweat. "Don Lorenzo," he gasped. "The warehouse. It's already burning. Someone gave the order." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "I didn't give that order," I shouted, looking at my phone. The feed was dead. Mikkel roared in anger, pulling his gun. "You double-crossed me." Everything exploded into chaos. The guards in the shadows opened fire. I tackled Elena to the ground, the sound of glass shattering and wood splintering filling the air. "Get to the altar," I screamed at her, return firing over the table. My father was down behind the oak desk. His own piece barked as he took out one of Mikkel's men. Luca was gone. He disappeared into the side exit at the first sign of trouble. I crawled toward Elena, the heat of the bullets passing over us like a swarm of angry hornets. "We have to go." I grabbed her hand, dragging her toward the nave of the church. The Romanovs were throwing everything they had at us. We were pinned down behind a marble pillar when I saw him, the man who had given the order to burn the warehouse. It wasn't an enemy. It was the consigliere, standing by the side door with a group of men I didn't recognize. They weren't wearing Morty colors. They weren't wearing Romanov colors. They were professionals. In that moment, the true scope of the betrayal hit me. This wasn't a war between families. It was a coup. Someone was taking out the heads of both syndicates at once. Dante. Elena's voice was a sharp cry of alarm. I looked up to see a red laser dot pulsing on her chest, right over the emerald. I didn't think. I threw myself on top of her just as a sniper round slammed into the marble pillar where her head had been a second ago. Dust and stone chips rained down on us. "I've got you," I whispered, my heart hammering against her back. "I've got you." We managed to reach the side exit, the sounds of the battle fading behind the heavy oak doors. We were in a narrow alleyway, the rain still pouring down. I saw a van idling at the end of the block. I didn't know if it was friend or foe, but we couldn't stay here. We ran for it, the shadows of the city swallowing us. As we reached the van, the back doors flew open. It was Luca. He looked terrified, his clothes torn. "Dante, get in. They're killing everyone. My father, Mikhail. It's a wipeout." I hesitated, my gun leveled at his head. "Why should I trust you, Luca?" He looked at Elena, then back at me. "Because I'm the only one who knows who's behind this, and if we stay here, we're next." I looked at Elena. She gave a small, desperate nod. We scrambled into the van just as a line of dark cars turned into the alley. The van sped through the night, the city of Chicago a blur of hostile neon. Luca was driving like a madman, his hands shaking on the wheel. "It's the Syndicate Council," he panted. "The guys from New York. They decided the Midwest was too messy. They used the Romanov-Moretti feud as a cover to clear the board. They're replacing us all with their own people." I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest. If New York was behind this, there was nowhere to hide. We were small fish in a very large, very bloody pond. I looked at Elena, who was huddled in the corner of the van, the emerald necklace still around her neck. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was a cold, hard determination. "Then we don't hide," she said, her voice cutting through Luca's panic. "If they want a clean board, we give them a bloodbath. They think we're dead or running. That's our only advantage." I looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She wasn't just a Ricci, she was a survivor. And maybe, in this world of monsters, that was the only kind of love that could endure. But as we turned onto a darkened bridge, the van suddenly lurched. A black SUV slammed into our side, sending us spinning toward the guardrail. The world went upside down. The sound of metal twisting and glass shattering was the last thing I heard before the van hit the water. The cold was instantaneous, a numbing shock that stole the breath from my lungs. I struggled against the seat belt, the water rising rapidly inside the cabin. I looked for Elena, seeing her silhouette struggling against the back door. I managed to free myself and swim toward her, my lungs screaming for air. We broke the surface of the river, the dark water dragging at our clothes. We were under the bridge, hidden from the street above. I saw the SUV stop, silhouettes peering over the edge. They fired a few rounds into the water, then, satisfied, they drove off. We dragged ourselves onto a small, muddy bank beneath the bridge. We were alive, but barely. Luca was nowhere to be seen. I looked at Elena, her wet hair plastered to her face, the emerald still shining like a beacon of defiance. "They think we're dead," I coughed, the water stinging my throat. She looked at the city lights reflecting off the river. "Good," she whispered, "because when we come back, we're not coming as Mortis or Rixis, we're coming as their worst nightmare." But as I reached for her, a dark shadow emerged from the bridge support. It was the consigliere, his silenced pistol aimed directly at my heart. "A very touching sentiment, Miss Ricci," he said, his voice as cold as the river. "But nightmares only work if you're awake. And I'm here to make sure you never wake up again." I felt the weight of the moment, the finality of the betrayal. I was out of bullets, out of time, and out of luck. The part two ends with the sound of a muffled click, the safety being disengaged. The muffled click of the safety was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It cut through the roar of the Chicago River and the frantic beating of my heart like a guillotine blade. The consigliere, Silvio's son, and a man I had called uncle for half my life, stood silhouetted against the bridge's iron skeleton. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth I remembered from Sunday dinners. "Don't make it difficult, Dante," he said, his voice flat. "The council wants a clean slate. No Mortys, no Romanovs, and certainly no Rixes to reclaim old debts." Elena moved beside me, her fingers digging into the mud of the bank, but I felt her shift toward the emerald at her throat. "You were my father's right hand," I coughed, tasting the metallic tang of river water and blood. "You burned the warehouse. You triggered the war." The consigliere gave a slight, mournful nod. "Your father grew soft, Dante. He let the Romanovs breathe. He let a girl's ghost dictate his successor's heart. Chicago needs a surgeon, not a sentimentalist." He raised the pistol, aligning the sights with the center of my forehead. In that heartbeat, the code of Omerta felt like a joke, a set of rules designed to keep the pawns in line while the kings moved to sacrifice them. I looked at Elena. She wasn't looking at the gun. She was looking at me, her green eyes reflecting the neon malice of the city above. There was a silent communication between us, a shared understanding that we were already dead in the eyes of the law and the lore. "Isabella didn't die in a car bomb," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The consigliere's hand wavered a fraction of an inch. I frowned, the confusion momentarily overriding my fear. "What did you say?" Elena stood up slowly, ignoring the weapon pointed at us. "Isabella was the first one to find out about the council's plan 10 years ago. She didn't die because of your life, Dante. She died because she tried to warn you about him." She pointed a finger at the consigliere. The revelation hit me harder than the van's impact with the water. My father hadn't failed to protect her. He had been betrayed from within by the very man who now stood as our judge, jury, and executioner. The consigliere's face didn't change, but his grip tightened. She was a complication. "Just like you." He began to squeeze the trigger. I didn't reach for a gun I didn't have. I lunged for his legs, a desperate, low tackle fueled by a decade of repressed grief. At the same moment, the sound of a high-caliber rifle cracked from the bridge above. The consigliere's head snapped back as a plume of red mist vanished into the rain. He collapsed into the mud, his body twitching once before falling still. I scrambled back, pulling Elena into the shadows of the concrete pier. "Who the hell was that?" I panted. A figure descended the maintenance ladder of the bridge with fluid, lethal grace. It was Luca. He was drenched, his Armani suit ruined, holding a sniper rifle like it was a part of his own body. He looked at the corpse of the consigliere and then at me. "I told you I was a businessman, Dante," Luca said, his voice ragged. "But I'm a Morty businessman. New York tried to buy me, but they forgot one thing. I like being the shadow, not the puppet." Luca stepped over the body, his eyes lingering on Elena. "The council is moving on the Lake Forest estate as we speak. Your father is dug in, but they've got mercenaries, not soldiers. If you want to save the Morty name, we have to go now." I looked at the man who had been a mole, a traitor, and now, apparently, a savior. In our world, the labels changed with the tide. I grabbed the consigliere's fallen pistol and checked the magazine. Full. "And why are you helping us now, Luca?" My cousin looked at the city skyline, his expression weary. "Because if New York takes Chicago, there's no room for people like us. We're too messy for their spreadsheets. Besides, Aunt Sophia would kill me in the afterlife if I let you die in a ditch. I turned to Elena. Her face was set in a mask of grim determination. If we go back there, it's a death trap, she said. I reached out, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It's a war, Elena, and I'm finally fighting the right one. She didn't hesitate. She took the extra magazine from Luca's belt. Then let's finish it. We reached the Lake Forest estate through a service tunnel meant for deliveries, a relic of the Prohibition era. The night was a cacophony of gunfire and the smell of burning pine. The mansion, which had always seemed like a fortress, looked like a wounded animal. Tracers lit up the darkness, arcing over the manicured lawns. Dante, Luca, and Elena moved through the gardens, a three-person strike team fueled by different shades of vengeance. We found my father in the ballroom, the crystal chandeliers shattered on the floor, glass crunching under our boots. Lorenzo Morti was wounded, leaning against a marble pillar, a submachine gun in his lap. He looked up as we approached, his eyes flickering with a ghost of a smile. "You came back," he wheezed. I knelt beside him, checking the wound in his side. It was deep, the blood soaking through his silk shirt. "I found the real snake, Papa. It was the consigliere." My father nodded slowly. "I knew. Too late, I knew. I let the fox guard the hen house because I was tired of the blood." The doors at the far end of the ballroom burst open. A dozen men in tactical gear, New York's cleaners, advanced in a pincer movement. "Get him behind the bar," I shouted to Luca. We dragged my father into cover just as a hail of lead tore through the plaster statues above us. Elena was beside me, her eyes sharp, the emerald necklace swinging with every movement. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a participant in the violent liturgy of the Morti family. We traded fire with the mercenaries, the ballroom turning into a slaughterhouse of velvet and marble. Luca was a demon with the rifle, picking off the attackers with surgical precision, while I laid down cover fire with the consigliere's pistol. But they kept coming. The council had deep pockets and a seemingly endless supply of lives to throw away. "We're going to get boxed in," Luca yelled over the din. I looked at the grand staircase. If we could reach the upper floor, we could drop down into the garage and exit through the rear gate. "Go," I commanded, grabbing my father's arm. We moved in a frantic, stumbling retreat. Elena provided the rear guard, firing with a composure that chilled me. She was a Ricci, born and bred in this darkness, and tonight the darkness was her ally. We reached the top of the stairs, the mercenaries right on our heels. I felt a sharp sting in my shoulder, a superficial graze, but a reminder that our luck was running thin. We burst into the master suite, the doors heavy oak. I locked them and shoved a dresser against the frame. "There's a hidden panel in the closet," my father whispered, his voice failing. "It leads to the cellar. Go, leave me." I gripped his hand, the old man's skin papery and cold. "Not a chance." Elena stepped forward, her hand resting on my father's shoulder. "We're leaving together, Don Lorenzo, not for the family, but because Dante won't leave his heart behind and I won't let him stay." The tunnel was cramped and smelled of damp earth. We carried my father through the darkness, the sounds of the mansion being torn apart echoing above us. We emerged in an old carriage house a mile from the main estate. A car was waiting, a classic Cadillac, the one my father only used for the most somber of occasions. It felt like a hearse. I put my father in the back and turned to Luca. "Take him to the doctor in Cicero. He knows the drill. He won't ask questions." Luca looked at the car, then at the burning horizon of the estate. "What about you?" I looked at Elena. She was standing by the door, the rain washing the soot from her face. She looked like a Valkyrie. "We have a meeting in the city," I said. "The council's regional head is at the Drake Hotel. He thinks he's won. He thinks he's having a victory dinner. I'm going to serve him the bill." Luca gave a grim nod, his hand lingering on the door handle. "Don't die, Dante. I don't want to have to run this city by myself." The Drake Hotel was a bastion of old-world luxury, its lobby a sea of gold leaf and hushed conversations. They didn't expect us. Why would they? We were ghosts, drowned in the river or burned in the mansion. I wore a stolen tuxedo, my shoulder bandaged, the pistol tucked into the small of my back. Elena walked beside me in a gown of shimmering silver, the emerald necklace the only piece of jewelry she wore. We looked like the perfect Chicago power couple, the kind that graced the charity galas and the boardrooms. We took the private elevator to the penthouse. The doors opened to a room filled with men in expensive suits, the air thick with the scent of celebration and prime rib. At the head of the table sat Anthony the architect, Valley, the man New York had sent to remodel the Midwest. He froze, his wine glass halfway to his lips as he saw us. "Dante Moretti," he whispered, his face turning the color of ash. "You're supposed to be at the bottom of the lake." I walked toward the table, the guests scattering like rats. I pulled out a chair for Elena, and she sat with the poise of a winter queen. I stood behind her, my hands resting on her shoulders. "Your architect didn't account for the foundation, Anthony," I said, my voice smooth and deadly. "The Mortys don't just occupy this city. We are the city. You tried to build your empire on a graveyard you didn't understand." Anthony reached for his jacket, but my pistol was already leveled at his forehead. "Don't," I warned. "The lobby is full of my men now. Luca cleaned out your perimeter. You're alone in a city that hates you." It was a lie. I had no men left, only a bluff and a prayer. But in the Mafia, perception is the only reality that matters. Anthony looked around the room, seeing the fear in his subordinate's eyes. He realized the coup had failed the moment I walked through the door. "What do you want?" Anthony asked, his voice trembling. I leaned in, the cold steel of the barrel grazing his skin. "I want you to leave. Every New York asset, every cent of council money, every suit you brought with you. You have until midnight tomorrow to be out of the state line. If I see a single New York license plate after that, I'll send you back to Manhattan in a series of small, well-labeled boxes." Anthony nodded frantically. "And one more thing," I added, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You will tell the council that Elena Ricci is off limits. If so much as a shadow falls on her, I will spend every dollar in the Morty treasury to burn your city down." I pulled back, the tension in the room breaking like a fever. I looked at Elena. She stood up, her eyes burning with a triumph that was better than any revenge. We walked out of the penthouse, the silence of the defeated following us even as the elevator doors closed. The night was finally ending. We stood on the balcony of my own penthouse, the one where this all began. The rain had stopped, leaving the city shimmering under a pale, pre-dawn sky. The neon lights of the loop were flickering out, one by one. I stood behind Elena, my arms wrapped around her waist, my chin resting on her shoulder. The emerald necklace was cold against my arm. "We did it," she whispered, her body relaxing against mine for the first time in days. "We survived the nightmare." I looked out at the jagged skyline, the jagged blade that had been pressed against our throats. "We didn't just survive it, Elena, we changed it, but there's a price." She turned in my arms, her face solemn. "My father is alive, but he's retired for real this time," I said. "Luca is running the day-to-day. And us, we're the ghosts that everyone is afraid to mention. We can't stay in Chicago. Not if we want to live a life that isn't measured in bullet counts." Elena reached up, her fingers tracing the emerald. "Where do we go?" I smiled, a genuine one that didn't feel like a mask. "I have a small house in the hills of Tuscany. It belonged to my mother's family. No phones, no manifests, no bodyguards, just the vineyards and the sun." Elena looked at the necklace, then back at me. And what about the ghosts, Dante? What about Isabella? What about the girl who wore this before me? I unfastened the clasp, the gold chain sliding through my fingers. I held the necklace over the edge of the balcony, the emerald catching the first rays of the rising sun. Isabella's story ended a long time ago, I said. This necklace served its purpose. It brought me back to life, but we don't need reminders of the graveyard anymore. I let go. The emerald plummeted into the darkness of the alleyway below, a single spark vanishing into the shadows. We didn't watch it hit the ground. We left Chicago as the sun fully crested the horizon, the city reflecting in the rearview mirror like a dream we were finally waking up from. We didn't have much, a few bags, a shared secret, and a love that had been forged in the middle of a war. As we crossed the state line, Elena reached over and took my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine. The silence in the car wasn't a heavy, weighted thing anymore. It was light, filled with the possibility of a world where midnight didn't mean a meeting with death, but the start of a new day. My name is Dante Moretti, and once I believed that love was a liability that got people buried. I was wrong. Love is the only thing that gives you the strength to dig your way out. Years later, in a small village where the air smells of grapes and salt, a man and a woman sit on a porch watching the twilight. They don't look like monsters. They don't look like heirs to empires. They look like people who have found peace at a price they were willing to pay. Sometimes the man looks at the woman's neck, seeing the faint mark where an emerald once rested, a scar of a life left behind. And sometimes at midnight he whispers into her ear, "I chose you." She doesn't have to ask why. She knows that in a world of darkness, they were each other's only light. The city of Chicago still remembers the night the Morettis and the Romanovs fell, a legend told in hushed tones in the backrooms of social clubs. But the ghosts are gone, and the only thing that remains is the story of a necklace given at midnight and the love that defied the underworld.